Hello, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Stuart Saturday Live. I'm your hostess, Andrea, the 17th century lady. Today's look is a little different from my usual look. It's in honor of Queen Anna of Denmark, the consort of Stuart King James VI of Scotland and First of England. Major fashion icon, as you can see, with all the pearls and the fantastic, elaborate clothing. You could see how intricate everything is there. And the hair, tall and proud, and with that pearl she so often wore in her portraits right above her forehead. Over on Instagram, I've been a tad obsessed with Maria Radojicic's account, and it's called The Queen of Ruffs. And there she shows her incredible work creating the 17th century ruffs for the series Mary and George. And oh my goodness, her work is absolutely incredible. And I recommend you all have a look on Instagram or just watch the series and pay close attention to the clothing. And of course, that series is rather relevant as it follows the story of the first Duke of Buckingham, who was a favorite of King James. Now, joining me today is historian Gareth Russell. Some of you may remember he was my guest last year on Season 1 of Stuart Saturday Live when he came to chat with me about The Palace, his book about Hampton Court Palace, and we focused on the 17th century history of that beautiful place. He has a new book coming out next week, and it's a new look at the life and loves of King James VI and First. And I have been reading. I've been reading it this week, and it's really great. I'm really interested, and I'm enjoying it. So, without further ado, joining us live from Belfast, please welcome Gareth Russell. Hello, Gareth.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure to have you back. Wow, we had such a nice chat last time. I couldn't wait to have another one.
Yeah, well, it was a very enjoyable, particularly with the dinner party question. But thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Well, before we start, congrats on the new book, which I have right here.
Oh, thank
Lovely,
you so
a
much.
nice thick book, and it's just gorgeous. I'm always excited when a new Stuart book comes out, but I love all your books. You can see I've got I had the Palace, and you also wrote Young and Damned and Fair about Catherine Howard. It's a privilege to have you on here, and I like looking through just to see how beautifully done this is. You have quite a few. You have your the map, the two maps. You have a great prologue and wonderful two sections of colored images. Beautiful, absolutely gorgeous stuff. And I was very honored to find that you listed my book, Sex and Sexuality in Stuart Britain, in the bibliography. So thank you. That's very kind.
No, not at all. Not kind. Delighted. It was very useful because I think sometimes in biography we can silo people into themselves and not always see the cultural or moral context in which they're existing. So to have such a thorough and frank and unsentimental look at sexuality like the one you wrote was immensely helpful to help set James in that broader moral context.
Well, thank you so much. It's so very gratifying to hear it's been useful. Well, this is quite compelling history. You must have gone all over the place looking at archival documents. I just want to know do you have a favorite archive? I mean, is there a place that you just loved working in?
I mean, I suppose it's not officially an archive, but the Bodleian Library is quite difficult to beat. It has so many. I have very fond memories of the Bodleian because I spent a lot of time there for Young and Damned and Fair, and it has these treasure troves of books hidden there, and it's immensely beautiful. But I mean, the National Archives as well. They're fantastic. I mean, I think the National Archives is a national treasure. I think it's brilliant. And
Yeah.
with this book, I suppose part of the other joy that it brought was being able to visit physical places as well, the sort of archive in stone, if you like. And
Hmm.
for me, the place that really took my breath away was Stirling Castle in Scotland, where James spent so much of his childhood. And it is just one of the most absolutely extraordinarily well preserved and curated homes in the British
Yes,
Isles.
I absolutely agree. I have an auntie and uncle who live in Stirling,
Ah,
so whenever we go to visit them, it's just a little short drive there, and it's so wonderful. It's a must see for a Stuart lover. It has to be, or any history lover. It's a beautiful place overlooking a lovely. There's amazing views from the top.
stunning, really stunning.
Gorgeous. Yeah. Well, that's great. Um, well, the book, of course, is about James, and really, he had an extremely unstable, traumatic, and violent childhood, didn't he? I mean, even in utero, a man was murdered in front of his mother. I mean, Rizzio. Um, so it must have been very traumatic. Here we have a rather romantic, much later picture, mezzotint from the 19th century, which depicts Mary and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who these were James's parents. Would you please tell us about some of the traumas young James faced, and also perhaps other childhood experiences which helped form or mold his adult character, please?
It's a great question because I think it was a complex childhood. And
Certainly.
and I think with his the trauma that he endured in the womb, as you mentioned, it's something really interesting that he mentions later in his life. He
Mm.
makes an extraordinary speech in 1605 to Parliament in London, where he says, you know, every man goes through difficult periods. Royalty goes through even more difficult periods because we're the highest tree. So the winds of politics shake us more. But then he says,
Yeah.
even among royalty, he has endured more than most kings have because of the vagaries of politics. And he said that it's followed him since his cradle. And even before then, I may say, since I was in my mother's belly. And he's very clearly referencing the assassination of his mother's secretary and advisor, David Rizzio. So he has an idea that he has been exposed to and followed by violence for most of his childhood. There are incidents relatively early on, including he witnesses the death from gunfire of his grandfather, the Earl of Lennox, when he's 4 years old. So he there are certainly incidents that stand out as traumatic and horrible for him. Really, the political chaos, though, that leads him to later being a very suspicious person happens more in his teenage years. And I was quite intrigued to see the way in which the household that raises him as a boy king at Stirling helps shutter him in. And they do keep politics at bay from the ages of, let's say, 4 until he's 11. So there is a period when the
Mm.
political chaos is not present. But there is a snake in Eden, if you like, in Stirling, which is the senior of his academic tutors, a man called George Buchanan, who had
Mm.
previously served at the court of James's mother, Queen Mary, and had turned against her when she fell from the throne. And he wrote extraordinarily vituperative political tracts justifying the coup against her. And it seemed very clear from when I was researching the book that he allowed that to bleed into the way he taught her son. And he really did lay on very thick the suggestions to James that his mother had been both politically and sexually disreputable and a monster, really. And I also,
Mhm.
I mean, I think I'm sure you're aware of this as well, Andrea, that we have to be careful of projecting too much back our own standards onto this period.
Yeah.
So I will only sort of use words like, abuse or misogyny or something like that if they are exceptional in the period. As distressing
Mhm.
as it is for us, the physical disciplining of children was considered a part of good child rearing.
Yeah.
And so when I say George Buchanan was abusive towards James, I mean that both by our standards and by theirs. And it's very clear that there are other people in the household at Stirling, chief among them James's governess, the Countess of Mar, who consider the level of physical punishment that Buchanan is inflicting on James to be both excessive and deliberately humiliating. So Buchanan is probably the figure that instills the most terror in James, and actually, even when he's in adulthood, there are stories of him shaking when he's recalling what happened in the classroom.
Yeah, that's absolutely awful, and it makes you wonder if why such a person would be in a position of power over and care over such a small child.
Yes, I think it's a consequence of the political instability that exists in Scotland at the heart of the monarchy after Queen Mary's downfall. So we
Yeah.
know that Buchanan was appointed by James's first regent, his uncle, the Earl of Murray, and he is kept in position by the next two regents, both of whom aren't there for very long. And he was very loyal, by the way, to the Lennoxes. Sorry, I should say, really, the Earl of Lennox, James's grandfather, is his great patron. But he also ingratiates himself with the fourth and last of the regents, the Earl of Morton. They later fall out, but Buchanan is able to hold on to his position because he's backed the right horse. And ideologically, Buchanan was a disastrous choice to be the tutor
Mm,
of a monarch, because he's not really a monarchist. And in
right.
fact, if Buchanan was alive today, I don't doubt he would be a Republican. And
Mm,
and unfortunately, he allows his ideology to dilute his humanity, and he seems to take an extraordinary, palpable pleasure in humiliating Queen Mary's son. And it was awful. I mean, that was probably one of the things researching Queen James that was the hardest to read and to
right.
research, because it really was gratuitous nastiness, cruelty, and a sort of petty vindictiveness on a defenseless child.
Oh, that's awful. And that, having that kind of person in his life combined with not having his parents, that's just an awful situation. And I'll mention this later, I think, about how that sort of impacts one's opinion about him and his later personality, perhaps. This situation is quite complex, and I think I do pity him. Really, it's a profoundly sad situation for a child. Um, but this reminds me of other things. When I was reading your book, I found that you boldly clear up several misconceptions and myths. Because there are lots of gray areas sometimes in that people, and you can't, or at least I find I couldn't like categorically say, oh, this like that, this happened. But it's so refreshing, I find, that you state, for example, that Lord Darnley, this notion that Lord Darnley had syphilis was likely untrue. I mean, even I have previously stated he had syphilis, so I may have to alter this based on your new research, and that's great. I like to have that question, that sort of thing. But there were quite a few things that leapt up at me, and one of them, for example, was I came across a section about James Douglas, 4th Earl of Morton, and you wrote, "For he was loved by none and envied and hated by many." And I thought, man, that's a bad state in which to be. Sure. I mean, if you're having a bad day, that's even worse. you know?
Yeah, he was competent. So I think he held the government. He was James's fourth regent, and
Mhm.
the fantastic, brilliant memoirs of the courtier Sir James Melville, who had such a great turn of phrase. And he
Mhm.
says, that many people were friends to his fortune and the fortune he brought to Scotland, but they didn't like him. And it
Right.
meant that when Morton starts to wobble, a lot of people aren't there to reach out and grab him as he falls. They let him fall.
Uh,
And
right.
he was hubristic. I mean, I think he got, as happened with many people before and since in very successful political careers, Morton got to the stage where he he believed he was untouchable, and certainly he does not seem to think that there's any threat either at Stirling or at Holyrood House to his position, and he ignores clear signs that a faction is building against him and that young King James is sympathetic to that clique. But to your point on his father, Lord Darnley, I have also previously said that he was syphilitic. I suppose really it was. I mean, there has been some debate before about the syphilis theory, and he
Yeah.
doesn't seem to have enough of the symptoms to justify. I mean, I think the standard argument is that he was in the secondary stage of syphilis. But he doesn't seem to have any symptoms that are unique to syphilis, and he doesn't really have enough of them.
Right.
It's possible that it was something else, and now what I will say is that the syphilis I think is unlikely, but I certainly couldn't say that it's impossible.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, but I was more dubious coming out of it than going into it about that claim.
Right. Right. Well, excellent. I like that. It's nice to think about these things. A question was sent in last month for my previous guest, Heather R. Darcy, and it was Mary Queen of Scots' marriage to Lord Bothwell intrigues me. Was it enforced, or did she agree to it willingly? And I know you do cover this early on in your book, but for those who are interested in Mary Queen of Scots, would you please give us your opinion on the matter?
Yes and no, in that I suppose this was something that I kept changing my mind about. And part of, I'll be honest, part of the relief is that if you're writing a biography of her son, you don't necessarily have to land as firmly as you would if I was writing a biography of Queen Mary. I suppose I lay out also in the footnotes if anyone's interested, or the endnotes, I should say, excuse me, anyone who's interested in researching more, I divide up those in favor of it being a coercive marriage and those in favor of it being something she planned. And I read them all, and I'll give that slightly annoying historian's answer. There are two crucial pieces of evidence that I think are quite hard to dismiss, but they back the alternative, the respective positions. So one is a remarkable paper by Leslie Smith about the twins that Queen Mary miscarried at Loch Leven after her downfall, and she argues very persuasively that they must have been that the gestation period was a lot longer than was claimed at the time, and it was post dated to the wedding, and that the only way that some of the features and details about the twins could possibly have been known is if they had been a month or two longer in the gestational period. So that does very strongly suggest that there was a sexual relationship between Queen Mary and the Earl of Bothwell before the abduction at Dunbar.
That's very
However,
interesting.
yes,
Yep.
it's fascinating, and if anyone's interested, I reference Leslie Smith's paper at the back of the book in the endnotes, as I say, if anyone wants to go and read the full thing. However, for me, the smoking gun, if you like, is from Sir James Melville, who I think crucially for us as historians was at Dunbar on the night of the abduction and the alleged assault. And Melville is under no illusions. There is no ambiguity in what he writes in his memoir. He very clearly states she had to marry him because he had sexually assaulted her. And I do not understand. To me, Melville was there. He was close to her afterwards, right the way up to the Battle of Langside. If you read his memoir, it is sympathetic to Mary, but it is not hagiographic. And trying to square those two, to me, I just can't find any way to discredit what Melville says. I really can't.
Right.
So this is my hesitant conclusion, and I would say I completely understand why other historians have reached a conclusion that either it was coercion or it wasn't. I can see how the evidence would get you to both places. I think there probably was an adulterous romantic relationship before the abduction at Dunbar.
Right.
I think that would explain the alleged gestational period of the twins that she lost at Loch Leven. However, it is not true that simply because a relationship begins consensually and happily that it continues in that arc. And I think it is possible, given just how physically and mentally unwell Mary was in the aftermath of her second husband's death, that it to me seems more than credible that Melville was telling the truth and that Bothwell physically and emotionally manipulated or abused her into the wedding, perhaps before she was ready. Or I was really struck writing the section of Mary's downfall by just how unwell she was.
Yeah.
And I cannot see that there would be any suggestion that the decisions she made at Dunbar or back in Edinburgh were made completely in her right mind. So I think it's perfectly possible to argue that it did begin consensually, but I do see, I think, elements of manipulation and abuse around the time of the marriage itself.
Yes, and I think you put that forward very persuasively, and I'm inclined to agree now. And among other things, I didn't know how unwell she was, both mentally and physically, and it's something it seems that it isn't really mentioned very often, or perhaps I hadn't paid attention much in the past because I tend to go into the later Stuart. But that is something that I found very interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you, and me too, in a way that, I mean, Mary is a very complex figure, and
Mm.
there were certainly elements in the way she behaved later on that justified her son's occasional distrust of her. But I
Mm.
also, and I don't take away from James having valid reasons to be slightly concerned about some of the political stories his mother was telling him in their letters. However, for me, Mary was this palpably sympathetic figure because there's such a tragedy when you realize that because of these few months after Darnley's murder, that she is, vomiting blood. She loses consciousness at one
Mm.
point. She's bedridden with stress. I got the impression of someone who had a severe spell of mental ill health caused by
Mm.
understandable stress. I mean, you can see it throughout
Yeah.
her reactions. And in those few months, her entire life was annihilated. And once she had recovered, and she does recover, I think when she's under house arrest at Lochleven in Scotland, it's too late. And so
Mm.
Mary is spent living the rest of her life in the ruins caused by those few months, and there was all the tragedy of the world in that for me. I really did feel immensely sorry for her.
Yes, as did I. Yep. Um, as for her son, what kind of man was James? And well, I wonder, yeah, if we can get a general idea of what kind of man he was.
Complex for a biographer. That's a gift, to have someone with so many shades to them. I suppose to start with the negative, he was an insufferable know-it-all. He was pedantic. He could be explosively badly tempered.
Ooh.
He unquestionably became a firm believer in the 1590 and 1591 North Berwick witch trials.
Mm.
His attitude towards witchcraft was later a lot more nuanced than I had realized. I think a lot of people realize, particularly by about the 1610s. I think he was someone who could be vindictive, uh, but primarily to enemies. I think you had to do something to him, and then you saw an often swift and brutal response. In terms of the positives, immensely and ferociously intelligent. I mean, really, the intelligence is palpable. Hugely loyal. He was not like a lot of other monarchs who would cast aside friends or lovers if they became politically unpopular. He was someone who would um, he was someone who I think would prefer to sink with the ship rather than abandon ship if that ship is a friendship or a relationship with someone. I
Right.
think he was a loving father. I think to me, he also was someone with such a deep yearning for family and for love, and above all, both politically and personally, for peace.
Mm.
So, an intellectually precocious and brilliant man, an emotionally complex, often sympathetic, often shocking individual. That's the James I think I came away with.
Wow, that pretty much sums it up. Well done.
Thank you.
And I think that you know you've absolutely got it right there about he he was what he was because of this terrible childhood, and he was a loving father, and And I think that's really lovely, because he was trying to change things. He didn't want to have a repeat of what he had experienced, I think.
Yeah, always. I think that's such an accurate assessment of it. I hadn't. There's a remarkable set of documents that from 1595, when he and his wife Anna are going through a bit of a rough patch in the marriage, specifically about the upbringing of their son, Prince Henry, and James very clearly and explicitly says to her, I cannot let you have as much of a say in bringing him up. I cannot let there be open access to his household, because I do not want him to ever go through the pain of being captured and used against us in the way I was captured and used against my own poor mother. So I do think the lessons of his childhood and his adolescence follow him for the rest of his life.
Right. And who do you think was James's first love?
Who first love, I think,
Yeah.
was was a teenage friend called Alexander Lindsay. The first lover, I think, was a man called Patrick Gray. That you can make a credible case for. Was there someone beforehand that we don't know? But he would have been about 17 or 18 when this fling with the, according to every source, stupendously good-looking Patrick Gray, a Scottish nobleman. But in the same breath as everyone said how good-looking he was, there was a general consensus that the personality did not match the looks, and that Patrick Gray had studied charm, and that he was a very comfortable liar and immensely ambitious. And in fact, James, when the relationship ended, James would say that you should not trust Patrick Gray. So I think he was the first. I think he was the first lover. I think you can make a credible case that there's another that I think there's even stronger evidence for close to the same time. But I think the first love, in terms of being romantic, and noticed by everyone, it is Alexander Lindsay, who later James ennobles as Lord Spiney. And Alexander Lindsay was a really lovely character to write about from a historical perspective, because you'll know this, that the Stuart period is often filled with fascinating people, but often quite sharp personalities. And I remember saying to my editor that I thought Alexander Lindsay seemed like the human equivalent of a golden retriever. He was just very sort of loving and loyal and just happy to be included. And wherever James went, he went. And I do remember thinking, gosh, in another world, they probably could have been really happy together. But they do what is expected of them, and there's remarkable letters between, Sandy going off to get married so that James can get married, and they do what they consider to be their duty. There is an absolutely jaw-dropping letter from James to Alexander Lindsay's future wife, Jean Lyon. And James says that he describes Sandy as someone who, out of my bed, I am willing to bestow on yours, which I don't think would have landed, if I was Jean, would have landed too well. But yes, given all the politics that have come before and that will come after, actually being able to write about a young man in his early 20s being in love with another young man in his early 20s, and them just being quite happy for a while, was a lovely thing to be able to narrate, because the 16th century isn't always rich in happiness.
Right. I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier about him being like a golden retriever, and this is my golden retriever.
Oh, I have one too. They're the best.
Yeah, they are. And he's got a rough on yesterday.
As he should. As he should. So that actually would be a perfect. If we ever do a TV show, I'll say that's the image I want for Alexander Lindsay. Golden retriever in a rough.
Perfect. Brilliant. Oh, wow. Well, let's turn now to the woman who became his wife, Anna. Well, not the golden retriever person's wife, but James' wife, Anna of Denmark.
Great golden retriever style hair here. Actually, it's a bean to the groomer. Yeah. Yes, Anna of Denmark. Andrea, I mean, I would say I loved writing about James and the 6 men he was in love with, and it was such a rich, fascinating story.
Yeah.
deep in my heart, though perhaps not even that deep. I think Anna might have been my favorite of one of the people I was writing about. I find her just a merry-go-round of historical fascination. She is such a um, palpable personality. You get such a sense of who she is from the documents, and you see even here this glittering declaration of queenship and of the consort at the center of monarchy rather than the periphery.
Yeah. And this is a Nicholas Hilliard's miniature portrait of the lady circa 1605, and it's from the Yale Center for British Art. And again, like the first image that we shared of her, amazing aesthetic, flamboyant, gorgeous, and utterly fashionable. So Gareth, what kind of person was she? I mean, please give us a bit of her background, because she
Yeah.
was an incredible person who so often is completely forgotten and ignored by many people. And I just think that's a shame. And I love that she's not overlooked in this book. I love it.
No, I don't know why people did. I know for a long time there was this pervasive, wildly off, inaccurate idea of her as I think one historian, I think it might have been Morris Ashley, actually referred to her in his history of the Stuart dynasty as a dumb blonde, which sort of takes the breath away a bit. But
Yeah, I think I
Anna,
remember something like that. Yeah,
it is, isn't it? It's a dumb blonde, and
something to that effect.
yeah.
Yeah.
I remember it being very jarring, and I suppose to some degree she was presented by a few historians in the 19th and early 20th century as part of a duo of frivolous, extravagant Stuart queens, pairing her with her future daughter-in-law Henrietta Maria. And then later, when Henrietta Maria began to be rehabilitated as a more substantial figure, there was an idea that Anna was sort of just self-indulgent and extravagant and shallow as a puddle. And I'm not one of those people who think to rehabilitate a historical figure, you have to exonerate them from everything. Anna was extravagant. Criticism of her spending and her occasional but memorable inability to separate personal grudge from political pragmatism, those are valid criticisms of her. She was the sister of Christian IV, the King of Denmark and Norway. She was a formidable player at court politics. As you say, she used glamour and the power that has. A hugely important patron of the arts, both literature and dance, music, and painting. Like James, a very loving, devoted parent. She could quarrel and feud better than most people. I mean, I think watching it, I thought, gosh, this is the only one who could probably hold a candle to this is Anne Boleyn. It felt like she knew, Anna just felt, I don't want to fight you, but if you annoy me, I will, and we'll win. That's the impression I gained of her. And also she was funny. She was really funny. There was letters I found between her and James, and they marry when he's in his 20s, she's still a teenager. And he does try his level best to make the marriage work. He sends Sandy away. There's about 5 years where there's no whisper of another favourite. But she is aware. She is aware, I think, about 1600, 1603, that he has an interest in men. And from 1603, she starts trying to pick the men that her husband will be intimate with, because she's pragmatic.
Quite interesting.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's thrilling.
Yeah, and I think most people don't realize how she was involved in that sort of selection.
What was very important for me in writing this book is to not bring too many cultural hangovers from what we have today. And I think sometimes there is an expectation that if you're writing about a homosexual or a bisexual man, that you will be importing 21st century stereotypes. And one of the I think the least helpful stereotypes associated with that is the poor, clueless wife of a gay man. We have that trope in our culture. And I do think that has factored into how a lot of early 21st century and late 20th century historians wrote about Anna, that she was a bit pathetic, and oh, how sad that she didn't realize. She did realize. And first of all, if she hadn't realized, it wouldn't have made her sad and pathetic. It's not any reflection on her at all. Nor on James, actually. It just is what it is. But with her, I think she actually did become probably his best friend. I mean, some of their letters to each other are so funny. It's one of the few times in archive I've laughed out loud. He's writing to her about the 70-year-old aristocrat who's marrying a 20-year-old, and he says, don't tell anyone, and I'm only telling you so you don't burst out laughing when they tell you. And she writes back and says, "How can I keep a secret, Your Majesty, that I've already told to everyone I've met?" It's very, she's sharp and she's clever, but with the men, I think she plays a huge role in picking George Villiers, who becomes, as you mentioned, the first Duke of Buckingham. And I go into the book about some of the outrageous ways she threw George in front of her husband because she hated Robert Carr, who was the favorite at the time. He laughed at her once, and she decided to have the last laugh.
He was, to be fair, he comes across as rather an odious kind of person. I don't know if you agree with that, but
yeah, he does. He was an interesting one. That's because the relationship was quite long-standing, and I say this without trying to be too patronizing, but I don't know if there's a way to avoid it with Robert, which is that I think his curse is Pinocchio thought he was a real boy. I think for the first 3 or so years of the relationship, Robert was very aware that he wasn't the brightest bulb in the box, that he didn't want to get involved in politics, and it's a happy time for him and for James. And then I think he got it into his head that he could be the arbiter of court politics and government. And he does become, I actually find him towards the end far more reprehensible than I find Buckingham. I find Robert really a perfect example of hubris and what it can do to you.
Yeah.
It really was a morality
Absolutely.
tale. And so I was kind of cheering Anna on when she kept finding increasingly skimpy masquerade costumes for George to wear and lending him her diamonds so it set off his eyes. I thought, Anna, if these are the cards you have been dealt, you are playing a winning hand with them. She was someone who I suppose, I think you'll have had this with Barbara, that sometimes there are people who come through the glass more than darkly. We actually see them in very clear, sharp outline. Their personality feels present in the sources. And sometimes, as with Barbara, it's not always the perfect personality, but it is a personality and it's real. And that keeps it interesting, both, I think, for us as writers and also as readers. That's one of the reasons why I enjoyed reading your book on Barbara, because I think I felt like it was a real person. It was someone that we have this vital, palpable sense of a character. And that's always a great joy to read and write.
Yes, and when you're in the archives and you're coming across these papers and you will start forming an idea of how someone was, how their behavior and their personality, and so we could start with secondary sources, other historians' tales, and at first I thought, oh, I have to be careful because this must not be exactly true. But when you start looking at primary sources and multiple people start having the same ideas and same observations about someone, you tend to have to go with that because that is there. It's there, and it's shades of that.
That's true. It's like if everyone's telling you you're dead, lie down, or if everyone's telling you you're drunk, stop drinking. And it's the same thing. If everyone has the same view, or most people do, then it's. I was never really under the impression. I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking a biographer's job is to exonerate, and actually it's just to explain.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yes, I do find that. Well, very amazing. But those of us who are already acquainted with this part of Stuart history already know that Anna was really interested in masks, which were these amazing, expensive Stuart-era theatricals, which incorporated lavish sets, costumes, music, dancing, and acting. What other things did Anna have interests in? I mean, other hobbies?
She enjoyed hunting very much, and I think that sometimes gets overshadowed because James, her husband, was such a passionate, some might say obsessive hunter. It was his favorite pastime by quite a distance. She was a very skilled hunter. There was actually, although not as skilled as him, there was a bit of a sad incident where they were at Tybalt's and his countryside palace in Hertfordshire. And I actually think at this point Anna's eyesight was starting to go a little bit, but she she took aim with her musket, and she watched at sort of the coursing deer, and she missed, and she hit and killed James's favorite hunting dog, Jowler, and she was devastated. I mean, James really lost his temper, as I suppose as you would, when it happened. But the next day, she was catatonic. She was horrified that she killed a beloved pet, and James had to go and comfort her. So I think the hunting pets, and in that incident, they married quite sadly. She also she loved playing cards. I mean, gambling was sort of a communal addiction for Jacobean upper classes, and I think right the way through the Restoration as well. But she loved that. She doesn't seem to have been as keen on music as some of the other patrons had been. I mean, she enjoyed it, but it's not a court that I think is famous for its musical output. She absolutely adored plays and the theatre, and she, I think, deserves far more of the credit for the royal patronage that Shakespeare so beneficially received than James. James nominally became Shakespeare's patron, but he had zero interest in most of his works, whereas Anna was constantly bringing Shakespeare's troupe to court, particularly for Christmases, and she really thoroughly enjoyed what he was doing. So she, to me, is someone, it's not all the art. She genuinely seems to be picking the things that she enjoys. Painting's another one where she sits for actually quite a significant number of royal portraits, but I wouldn't say you couldn't compare her necessarily to her son, Charles the First. But Charles, I suppose maybe that's a little unfair on my part, because Charles is such a big patron of the arts.
He was a massive one, so it's hard to
yes,
right.
It is. That's right. But he did. I think he got some of that from her. She did have a good art collection. She not
Probably,
anything that his was, but she certainly they did. I know that her and Charles enjoyed talking about art. The other thing that she loved, which I think I loved it, was she loved food and the politics of hosting. She was apparently a brilliant host, and she believed if you were hosting anyone, you had to put on a good spread, good food. So she had excellent cooks, and actually they're quite lovely little thank you notes from her son Prince Charles every time when he was an adult or a little bit older, after 16, every time he went to her household for supper, he would send a thank you note for the good dinner. It was always excellent food, and Anna really believed in that. She used to play bowls as well. She's a keen bowler.
Oh, I quite like bowls too. When we lived in Shropshire, there was a bowling green right opposite us.
Oh,
and that was fun. I haven't played for a few years, but I can understand.
It'll come back to you.
So, we talked a bit about her relationship with James. What kind of relationship did they have? She already knew about his interests in men, but did they get on well? Were they able to have some kind of carry on?
I don't think anyone ever knew him as well as she did. I think she knew him the longest. By the time she dies in 1619, it's really her and maybe some of his cousins on the Stuart side, the Duke of Lennox, Ludovic, and Thomas Erskine, who he'd grown up with at Stirling and was captain of his guard. But Anna really is in this very tight inner circle who know the complexities of James's personality because they've seen it play out over the decades. She is immensely protective of him. And one of the conditions she lays down with George is that he will look after him and that he won't allow, the Duke of Buckingham, I should say, sorry, George Villiers. She makes it very clear to him that she wants Villiers to protect James from being taken advantage of in the way she felt he had been by Robert Carr. They do have a very similar sense of humor, which is quite a sharp sense of humor, very observational. They're married for 29 years. And I think it goes through different periods as any long-term relationship will. There are rough patches. 1594, 95, 96 is not a happy period. 1600 is another stressful year. The first stage is caused by a strong disagreement that I mentioned over the upbringing of their first child. The second, I think, is caused by his by the first really indiscreet liaison with a man or interaction with a man that she had seen firsthand. And
Right.
I think for her, partly the shock was how close it had come to causing really severe damage to the prestige of their dynasty in England and in
I
France,
see.
with this gossip spreading abroad. So,
Right.
but she also, I suppose, she had firm lines with him, which were, there were conditions. And one of those conditions was that these favorites could flourish, but they would never flourish more than she did. And that there had to be an absolute respect for her at any and all times as the queen. And to some degree, I think the fact that they were men and not mistresses worked to her advantage. She was a very different character to Catherine of Braganza, but there was never any
Mm.
suggestion that she would be put in the same kind of position that Catherine of Braganza was at Hampton Court with Barbara in 1662, and she certainly would not be put in the position of contemporaries like Marie de Medici as Henri IV's queen in France, who had to endure many mistresses at court and the sight of her husband's illegitimate children rising to
Yes.
prominence alongside them. So Anna, in some ways, made her peace with this and decided to
Mm.
make the best of it. So she was, but sometimes the ending tells you everything, and James's physical and mental reaction when she dies is quite moving, and it was extreme.
Mm.
He was bedridden, and I find that, as with the death of their son Prince Frederick, which I'm sure many of your viewers will be familiar with,
Yeah.
that was a very moving thing to write about, because I think love is a big part of this book. It's an eternal emotion. The politics are very
Mhm.
much of their time, and for me equally interesting. But also, I suppose, without becoming too emotional about it, I think grief is an eternal connector of us all, and the way that grief has this unique ability to frighten us with the intensity of loss. That is something that James does experience when Anna dies, and to me, a lot of the crises and mistakes that bedeviled his last 6 years as king were because she wasn't there.
Wow, that's quite something to think about. Um, so he did definitely have a love for her, which was definitely proven in how he grieved so much when she died.
Yes, I think so,
Um,
because I think,
yeah,
sorry, just off that point, I think
yeah. Go ahead.
you say a love, and I think that's a
Yeah.
beautiful way to put it, Andrea, because it's, in a world like, if they were alive today, or if James had lived for somehow in a world where he could have been with one of those men, I don't think he would have chosen Anna, and I don't think vice versa. But
Hmm.
as dynastic arranged marriages went, it was, I think, a storming success.
Yeah. I mean, they had what, three
7,
surviving children.
yeah,
Yeah,
7
but
total. Yeah,
seven total, three of which survived. So that's pretty good at that time.
it is.
Um, and yes, remarkable couple of people, and the figures in their life, their their time together and everything. And yeah, I think she did very well with the circumstances. And she was quite loyal to him, wasn't she? I mean, do we know of any extramarital affair from her or anything?
No, we do know there were rumors early on that
Mhm.
she might have been in love with a man who was considered the best-looking man in the Scottish nobility. He had nicknames about it in Scotland. The Earl of Murray, not James's uncle, but the next Earl. He was called the Bonnie Earl of Murray, and she was there were ballads linking the two of them, but really, apart from Anna
Mhm.
ever commenting that he was a very handsome man, there was never anything there at
Right.
all. She was very irritated by the rumors, but
Oh, well, yeah. I can understand that. Um, although, Robert Carr had been a favorite, and you mentioned him earlier, um, another did eventually surpass him completely. And, let's talk a bit more about George Villiers, who became the first Duke of Buckingham. Who was he, and why was he so important in James's life? Uh,
George's Villiers is such a fascinating character for many reasons. One of which is a bit like I sometimes think of him in a strange way as like a Jacobean Errol Flynn. And what I mean by that is that he is living proof, or not living, he was living proof of the unbelievable impact but being extremely good looking.
Yeah.
Extreme
It's
good looks.
funny. Yeah, I'm sorry. Just
Yeah,
hold on for a moment. I think it's funny that you mentioned Errol Flynn, because when I found this portrait, and this is a profile portrait of him by Peter Oliver, circa 1612, he reminded me immediately of Basil Rathbone,
oh
and
yes,
the sort of the dashing golden age Hollywood actor, that sort of look. And so, yeah, in your book you mentioned he had a beautiful set of teeth, and that
yes.
when he had a toothache and he was considering having it pulled out, James stopped him because it would ruin the look. So,
Perfect smile. Yeah,
wow,
James
yeah,
begged him not to, and actually the toothache did go away. So James was right, but
good.
Villers is proof of what being extremely good looking can do, and I don't think any portrait ever quite gets it, because I mean, I don't think portraits can, because probably it's a bit like Barbara as well, when they said that they couldn't get it at whatever it was. But every single person who encounters him, it's the first thing they write about, that he is improbably
Yes,
handsome. And so it's an interesting thing to see where charm, I've written about Anne Boleyn before. That's where a case where charm and charisma can do extraordinary things to your life.
yes,
And with George Villers, it's good looks, and he comes from an old family, but a family that I think have holes in their castle roof they can't afford to fix. And his remarkable mother, Mary Beaumont, she sinks a lot of her limited resources into sending him to a finishing school in France for gentlemen. He comes back with his manners matching his appearance, sort of both exquisite. And he happens to arrive at court just at the moment as the Queen, Anna, and Archbishop George Abbot Canterbury are sick to their back teeth of Robert Carr and want him gone. So you have this family, they're hoping to find some way to parlay their son's remarkable good looks into enough money to fix up the family home and keep themselves comfortable, arriving back with a perfect education, great good looks, at that moment where the stage is set, just waiting for someone like him to arrive at court. So he replaces Robert. Robert does sort of author his own destruction, but Robert then weakens himself at the same point as George rises. And it's probably around late 1615. There's an interesting letter from George that alludes that they first slept together at Farnham Castle during a hunting trip. So I mean, there's obviously no reason for George to be lying in a private letter to James, so I think we can accept that. The autumn, and really you then see the last decade of James's life is shaped by this love affair with George Villers, and he rises to become he sort of like a shooting star through the ranks of the aristocracy, from baron to duke in record time. He becomes, for many, the symbol of everything that was wrong with the late Jacobean monarchy. And I think there's some justification for that. I think he did become increasingly hubristic, selfish, extravagant, manipulative. But there were other parts of him that I found, maybe not endearing is the right word, but more sympathetic. He was very efficient and conscientious in his duties as master of the horse, then later in control of the navy. I do think he sincerely wanted to reform it and improve conditions for the men who worked for it. He was very kind and considerate to his wife, Catherine Manners, the Duchess of Buckingham, and also the letters that he sent to James. I don't doubt that the quill was often dipped in the inkwell of self-interest when it came to writing them, but I think the affection was also there. I think he grew an affection for James. I think it started out as purely transactional, but again, by the end, I think George was genuinely sad when James died. I wouldn't say he was heartbroken, but I do think there was affection there. So a more complex man than we're often led to believe.
Yes, yes, and I'm rather fond of the Villers, and so yes, there's the pros and cons about them, but they're a very interesting family.
Very much so.
And yes, and of course, for those who don't know, I wrote a biography of George's elder half brother's granddaughter, so it's the same family.
Yes, they have charisma coming out of their fingertips as a family, I think.
Yes, and the thing is that great beauty which George had did go. It was hereditary. I mean, Barbara was known for being absolutely stunning, so she had that Villa's beauty.
Yes, it's
and that helped.
very much so. But that's interesting because I think Mary Beaumont, who was George's mother, was also considered a great beauty. But if it's also
Mhm.
coming down from Barbara's side, it probably indicates that his father, that George
Yeah.
Villiers Senior, was probably very good looking as well, because it's not just coming from one side then if it's going to Barbara.
Yeah. I think Barbara's father, William, was also extremely good looking. So I think, if you keep seeing this
Yeah.
going on, there's
It's
a pattern there.
it's quite a nice genetic trait to have if you're to inherit.
Yeah. And they had great power. I mean, they didn't have a lot of money sometimes in some periods in the 17th century, but they seemed to make things better throughout the century. Well, Valentine's Day was yesterday, and I have some of the lovely offerings from the 17th century lord behind me. I'm
They're
very
beautiful.
pleased. I love roses. Yes, it's great. So that leads me to my next question. Was James at all romantic? I mean, do we have any examples of gifts or gestures from him to those he loved romantically?
Yes, the letters, to particularly one towards the end to Robert Carr, which is romance when it's falling apart, and the pain and the genuine love in it is palpable. There's some very, very affectionate letters, loving romantic letters to George, mine own sweetheart. I rode on this day. With tears streaming down my face at your absence, I desire nothing more than to have you in my arms again. And there also were gifts. He had a miniature of George hung in blue, which obviously was their romantic colour, our version of red. He hung it over
Mhm.
his heart when George was away from court. And he also gave a sort of courting gift that would be much more common to betrothed couples, of himself in diamonds, a miniature of himself in diamonds to Robert Carr.
All
So
right.
it's yes, he could be very, very romantic.
Wow. Lovely. By the way, this is a portrait of James circa 1618, and it's attributed to Paul van Sommer. And I think he's, he's getting on now in this image. Looking pretty good, I think. And yeah, definitely an older image. And what do you think of it?
Yeah, he starts. You're starting to see little bits. I mean, the portrait I used at the last portrait of him in the book is a few years after this, and you can see the
Mm,
deterioration much more markedly. James,
wow.
increasingly by this stage in his life, it's actually maybe a year or two afterwards. You can just see, I think, a little bit of the beginning here, but he had an increasingly difficult but dependent relationship on alcohol that I do think in the final few years contributed
Yeah.
quite strongly to his physical decline. He also was, as I mentioned, the hunting. He just, it was his passion. It was where he was happiest, and there were
Mm,
quite a few horse riding accidents that increased mobility issues, and he wouldn't
wow.
stop. So I think this is the turning point. And actually, the year before this was painted, 1617 is the first point where his health gives serious cause for concerns. So this is sort of
Ah,
the last blooming, if you like, and the next year his wife would die, and from then on, I think the physical disintegration was if not rapid, certainly sustained.
I see. Wow. Um, so you've also narrated this book.
Yes.
I'd like to talk a bit about this. Was this your first experience with narration? And what did you think of the process?
Well, I loved the process. I was in the
Mhm.
studio for the best part of a week in London in January. I quite mercifully had managed to dodge the Christmas lurgy and the Christmas bad throat, and I was very concerned and it was so soon after the end of the Christmas holidays that I had a much quieter New Year's. I just went up to the north coast of Northern Ireland with a few friends and
Mhm.
fireside and good dinners, as Anna of Denmark would have us do, rather than be too at risk of a session cancelling bad throat. I loved it. I had a wonderful producer, Poppy Humphreys, in London, and it was a quite a lovely thing in a very strange way that I haven't had with other books. Yes, this is the first one I've done in studio to narrate from start to finish, and in a very odd way, this is the first book where you get a clear sense of saying goodbye, because obviously you'll know this. You're editing the book, and there's little things that you're tweaking. Should there be
Yeah.
a comma here, all the rest of it, and
Yeah.
actually. finishing writing the last chapter is never really the end, because you've so many more things to do in formatting before it hits the shelves.
Yeah.
But because the audiobook is the full unabridged final version of Queen James, I got to actually end it for myself, where I end it for the reader, and to read the last few words. It was lovely. It was a very happy experience, and I did worry going into it. I thought, goodness, my brother-in-law is Scottish, I should say. I thought, I hope I'm not having a Northern Irish sense of hubris and thinking I'll know how to pronounce all the Scottish words because we're so similar. So I did make sure to check the Scottish place names for the first half of the book. Immensely, I loved it. I absolutely loved doing it, Andrea, and I hope anyone who prefers their books on audio will enjoy it too.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know if you know, but my husband and I also produce audiobooks, and it's we can't do it all in one week, I'm afraid, because of all the other commitments we have.
Yes.
But we just finished one, and it's a wonderful sense of, oh, we finished it, and there's a lot involved. My husband does narration and the editing, so it's like full on. He's got like 3 jobs at one, and he composes the music too. So he's got a lot of work to do all the time.
That puts me to shame, Gavin, quite aggressively. That's very impressive.
I can't do any of that. I just do the narration. That's enough for me.
No, most people can only do the narration. That's hugely impressive.
Yeah, he's been working on a piece in it, and I really liked it. But people seem to not realize sometimes how much work really goes into an audiobook. They think that it's just, oh, you just read it. They don't realize that sometimes you mispronounce things, you have to repeat yourself. Sometimes your mouth doesn't really cooperate, and you're
yeah. There was one word in this book that I said to the producers, like, I'm so sorry, I don't know why. I can tell your listeners that they will never again see the word remunerate in any of my books. It will never ever be typed by me again. It was that was a moment, and then you think maybe I've forgotten how to speak. But but there were what was quite interesting was learning little tricks of the trade, like green apples being quite good to sort of help your mouth not get too clogged up with all the horrible things that you have to learn. But it's a lovely experience in that whilst it's long, and it was 9 to 5 while we were doing it, which is lucky, because it means you can do it in a week, as she mentioned, if you just have the luxury of that. But it also, it's not just talking, you are sort of performing the book slightly. And that doesn't mean it's a play, but you're hopefully reading it in a way that is interesting and engaging to the listener.
Yeah, I think it's really good to do as well, because and I love that you've been able to do your own work, because you can really put your own heart into it, even more so. But I wish more publishers would take on audiobooks, because there's a whole audience of people, not just people with visual needs, that really use these. I mean, you could use them anywhere. You could use them in the car or while you're making dinner or whatever. It's just a really lovely way of enjoying a book.
I think so, and I'm very lucky that the publisher I have for this, HarperCollins, they do commit to having the audiobooks, and it was a wonderful process to do, because I do listen to audiobooks as well when I'm traveling or when I'm walking. And if there's a longer drive, I think sometimes it's better to have an audiobook rather than just sitting thinking the whole trip. So no, I completely agree. I also think that there used to be this stigma around audiobooks that mercifully has receded, that somehow it's easier. That's nonsense. Different people have different ways of wanting to experience a story, which is what a book is. So I really had an absolutely marvelous time doing it.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, I think it's going back to the biography. I think it's funny. I often reflect upon how one can have preconceived notions about historical figures based on peripheral reading, what I've mentioned before, and whatnot. And then to have these notions tested and sometimes altered by exposure to primary sources. In my case, I didn't have a really favorable view of James, especially with dealings. I mean, we mentioned witch hunting, and there are certain aspects of his personality, but I said earlier, I pitied him particularly for his lamentably sad childhood and the sort of paranoia he had to grow up with about being assassinated. But I think I think you have made me see him in a new light, which is great, and I really thank you for that. It's been really refreshing, and I think it's a very balanced and beautiful view of him. It's very it's full of wonderful information. So well done.
That's immensely kind, particularly coming from you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. But last time you were here, you answered my question about what your fantasy Stuart dinner party would be. And I think you first said you'd invite Henrietta Maria, but then you changed it to Anna of Denmark. Since it's been nearly a year since you last answered that, I'd like to know if you changed your answer, and if so, would it still be Anna? Or you can have more people at your party.
Yeah, I mean, look, I suppose actually after finishing this book, I'd be really interested to see George Villiers. I would just see what it was. What was the personality that he was like? I think it would be so interesting because how is this man able, that we think of as so odious, to form these really intense loyalties from people? So that would be fascinating. I do still think, though, if I wanted to have a really good night and good conversation, it would be Henrietta Maria and/or Anna would be very difficult to beat. But after all that, I think out of sheer interest, maybe James, just to see if I was hitting the right note.
Yeah, that would be great. And do you still have the same spread then?
I think so. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, great.
Do you know? Yeah, maybe. I'm still fascinated by Henrietta Maria, and I think she'd be great fun. But I don't know. Having spent so long in the Jacobean world, I don't think I could pass up the chance to invite one of them to dinner.
Yeah, sounds like a lovely time anyway. And I think this is going to be really far left field and everything. But the other day, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take a group of these people and present, I don't know, Taco Bell or McDonald's, something like that.
They
the quail and pheasant.
Yeah, they probably, I think, could get behind fast food in a way, because I'm sure it's not too dissimilar from like pack a pie for your hunting trip. They would get it, I think. It might be, I think mine would be blown, though, at the variety in a supermarket. That might just be completely overwhelming for them.
Yes, I mean, it is quite overwhelming when you look in the massive superstore and there's everything.
Yeah, which even the wealthiest of them would never have had access to.
No. And like downstairs, I've got Spice Corner, loads and loads of racks of spices.
You would be the richest person they'd ever met.
I would, yeah. Fantastic. So the research for this book, did it pique your interest in another historical figure?
I think at this point it was, well, yes, all of them, I suppose, in a way. To me, the Stuarts and this transitional period out of the Tudors as well is fascinating. I know I'm preaching to the choir here with you and with this channel and your listeners, because I don't know. I think we're having a moment. I think we are seeing the Stuarts really come back to the center stage of popular interest. It still has some way to go, but I think they're more than capable of holding fascination for us all. So fingers crossed it keeps going in that way, because I think they are thrilling.
Oh, I hope so. Yep. So after this book, I know you're just doing this right now. I'm wondering if you're going to take a break, or have you a new research topic in your head?
I will be taking a bit of a break, but yes, I'll be working on a book about the fall of the French monarchy. So which was what my undergrad dissertation was on. I French history was what I was doing, and then pivoted to medieval in my postgraduate. So it's actually, in a really strange way, it's a bit of a return for me.
That's great. I had no idea. That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, best of luck with everything.
Thank you. You might, if you see me just sobbing into a series of royalist letters, you'll know that the research has continued in earnest. It's a complicated
Oh
period,
dear.
but it's just fascinating.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have you here again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. You don't need to thank me. I had a wonderful time.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Goodbye. Oh, well, that was fascinating. And you too can learn all about the figures we discussed today and more in Gareth's new and fascinating book, Queen James, which will be published here in the UK on the 27th of February. Over in the USA, it will be released under the title The Six Loves of James I in December. Next month, I'll be joined by Dr. Daniel Jordan, who will chat with me about Thomas Butler. Until then, thank you for joining us today. And don't forget to keep it Stuart. Goodbye.